Okay, we'll get started in just a second, folks. Great. Tracy, you want to welcome everybody and get things kicked off?
Sure. Thanks, Laura. First of all, hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thanks for being here. My name is Tracy Oster. I am Executive Director of Downtown on the Go, and I really appreciate everyone being here today. I'm really excited about our Friday Forum series this year, mostly around housing and how it intersects with transportation. And I think they're all going to be really interesting. We have a great panel today, and it's going to be really good. So I hope you enjoy it. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, Tracy. Thank you, everybody, for being here. My name is Laura Swan-Zarek. I'm the Advocacy Coordinator at Downtown on the Go. I want to sincerely thank everyone for being with us today. I want to let you know a couple of things about how this webinar will work. There are automated closed captions available on Zoom. So I believe it says live transcription or CC at the bottom. You can click that to turn captions on. So every year, Downtown on the Go hosts a Friday Forum series. This year, we'll be exploring the question, what does it mean to be home in Tacoma, by diving into the link between housing and transportation. Today, we'll be discussing how often complicated planning processes like zoning get decided and how they influence our daily lives. There will be a Q&A section at the end of the forum, so you can submit your questions at any time using the Q&A function on Zoom. This forum is being recorded. And it will be shared on Downtown on the Go social media accounts. With that, we're going to get started, and I'd like to introduce our moderator, Tanisha Jumper. Tanisha is the Media and Communications Director for the City of Tacoma. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to be here with you. Today, I have a great panel of Rubén Casas, Brian Boudet, and Alyssa Torres. And we're going to have a really good conversation about zoning and planning and how all those things work together to make a city work, and in some cases not work so well. And so we're going to jump right into the conversation because I think this is my fourth year maybe doing this, and we never have enough time for the conversation. So like Laura said, if you hear something that you have a question about, put that question in the chat and we will get to all your questions at the end. But for right now, I'm going to invite my panelists to tell us a little bit about themselves, and then what is your connection to land use in Tacoma? And we're going to start with Rubén.
Hi, my name is Rubén Casas, and I am faculty at the University of Washington, Tacoma. My connection with land use and zoning is both personal, but also professional. Like everybody else that lives in an urban landscape or a city. I think land zoning and land use policies and decisions and questions and issues impact my ability to live and to have a good life, right, in the city. Professionally, though, I'm also interested in these questions because increasingly, I think that there is a connection to be made between how our cities and our built environments are organized, designed, and also sort of the social and public experiences that people have in places and spaces. So one of the things I'm interested in is how a particular city or region's design impacts civic engagement, people's sense of belonging, whether or not they feel a sense of home, and that sort of thing. So that's how I'm interested in this question.
Thank you for being here with me today. Alyssa?
Oh, I wasn't expecting you to go to me next. I'm usually last, but hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alyssa Torrez. I am connected to land use in a couple different ways, just like everyone here. My main role here today is as a representative of the Planning Commission. So I volunteer to work on the Planning Commission with city staff. And I represent District 4, so it's like East Side. And I'm, a homeowner here in the East Side. And in my day job, I also work for the Tacoma Housing Authority in real estate development. So lots of overlap between zoning, housing, land use, building complete, neighborhoods. So really, just honored to be serving in these roles and to be a part of today's panel. So thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here with me today. My maiden name was a S, so I tend to not make the people at the end of the alphabet wait. And all of you with those names that starts with A's, B's, and C's, sometimes you guys can wait till the last two. So, and my colleague, Brian Boudet.
Thanks, Tanisha, and thanks to everybody. A pleasure to be here with you today. My name is Brian Boudet, and I am the planning manager for the city of Tacoma. So I actually manage the city's long-range planning group. And in that role, we work with the community and the city council and the planning commission, volunteers like Alyssa, to really craft the city's vision document, what the community wants to look like moving forward, as well as the regulations, the zoning and other regulations that really help to implement that. So I really enjoy cities. I'm sort of passionate about just the inherent livability and the dynamism, I guess, of cities as places where innovation happens, where people connect, where technology occurs, those sorts of things. So like I say, really interested in livability and the community process that is planning.
All right, well, Brian, we're going to start with you. What is zoning and why does it matter? As the director for the city of Tacoma, I get that question a lot. If people, me and you've talked about how do you make that simple. So in the simplest terms, what is zoning and why does it matter?
So thanks, Tanisha. So zoning is essentially a tool that primarily local governments have. And the big mechanism it does is that it controls new development. So it in its basic form, zoning really talks about what kinds of things can go where in the community, and then also talks about how big they can be, what sort of standards they need to meet. So it's the community establishing standards for new growth, new development, new buildings, and things like that that happen in the community. So the original concept, largely, and this is over 100+ years, zoning's kind of been around in its current form, started out of a lot of kind of nuisance control. In particular, there was a lot of concern early on about lots of folks living right next to dirty, nasty, stinky factories and things like that, basically creating unhealthy places to live, issues with crowding and stuff like that. So over that 100 years, it's evolved quite a bit to include not just those basic concepts, but much more refined ones about design and environmental protection and historic preservation and things like that. So zoning is at some level a big deal. I think of it that I'm a little bit, I'm not probably not fair in judging this, but I think that that zoning and land use control is actually one of the more significant powers that local government has, because it has a lot of local discretion to really decide what the future looks like, how it's going to respond to the changing world around it, and how it makes sure that new development best fits into that to achieve the community's goals.
Thank you for that. And I know in our initial kind of conversation to get to know each other, Rubén, you had some thoughts about how that impacts people, individual lives. And so I'd love for you to speak to that.
Yeah, thanks. So like Brian, I agree that I think the origins of land use policies and zoning in particular, they originate in a place where we were trying to prevent people from getting sick because there were no regulations, against, building a polluting factory next to a residential area. But over the years, and I think what we're coming to realize now is that these initial good intentions have had other direct and indirect effects, not only in how we prevent people from living separate from polluting industries, for example, but how we have effectively also separated people from other people. And in some cases, what we're realizing now is that as much as a potentially useful and productive tool, zoning and land use policy could be or has been, it also has created instances where pre-existing social and racial dynamics sort of become manifest through policy. And so we have instances across the US where zoning has also been used to segregate neighborhoods and segregate people from public goods and public services. Over the decades, what we have now is situations like what we're seeing in Tacoma, where there's a scarcity of housing, or there's a scarcity of goods and services available in neighborhoods that really need them. So we have a concentration, for example, of good and desirable homes in one part of the city that also happens to be attended by good schools, good sidewalks, good parks. But there might be other parts of the city where not only do people actually live next to polluting industries and businesses, they also don't have the benefit of having good schools. They don't have the benefit of having sidewalks. They don't have the benefit of having good transit. So I think what we are realizing that in the best case, zoning and land use policies are a mixed bag. And in the worst case, they've actually exacerbated some of the very issues that we have tried to address through land use policy.
Yeah. Alyssa, you want to jump in here?
Sure. I think at its very base, zoning really tells us who can live where and what choices people that live in our city have, right? The way our city is zoned right now, it's mostly single family homes. And if you don't want to live in a single family home or you can't afford it, you have really limited choices. So it's really about, some of the work we're doing in the Planning Commission, really about trying to allow more housing types so that people have more choice, so that you can access those resources that Rubén was mentioning, that you can, be an active member of your community. So really, zoning does impact everything. Really, like that's a big statement, but as Brian said, it's really the fabric of our city. So it's a really important piece of the work that we do on the Planning Commission, and we really try to make sure that we're trying to make decisions around zoning that are equitable for our city. So it's a big undertaking, but we're here to make it happen.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I think, there's kind of the neutral, I think Rubén, you might have said this in our introductory meeting, like there's the neutral part of zoning that's just like, here's the rules, and and they're really helpful when it comes to, like, you don't want your next door neighbor raising raccoons next door, and there's like zoning and land use, and there's these like policies that say that can't happen there, that needs to happen over here, and you can have this here, and you can't have a building that's blocking your site, and that's really helpful, and those things seem very neutral. But then there's the other policies that over time have kind of been more about policy and public opinion and who's deserving and who's not deserving. And I think that what we've seen is that there's a lot of work being done to try to rectify some of those things, where maybe things have swung too far one way or swung too far the other way, or just all of the unintended consequences or ramifications of that. So I think one of the things that we talked about a lot was how this intersects with transportation, and how land use policy and transportation kind of go hand in hand, or maybe sometimes don't, and what are the unintended consequences of that. And so Brian, you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that I think land use and transportation have always been inextricably linked. They certainly are in the conversations that Tacoma has about zoning. We have, access is a general concept, has been a huge component of where the city of Tacoma and the council's adopted policies have focused growth for a long time. And we've had long partnerships with Pierce Transit and others. You will see that not only in Tacoma zoning, there's a lot of talk about mixed use centers. And those mixed use centers were designated, 25 years ago. And those are located in places generally where there has been, and it continues to be, good transit service, at least a focus for where the highest transit service is. Plenty of questions about whether it's still good enough or not to really facilitate, not having a car, but nonetheless, it tends to be where we have the most. And this also plays out very much. I know, there's been a lot of community dialogue recently about home in Tacoma, and as a huge potential shift in these land use pattern and zoning scheme. And the huge conversation there really was in the council's mind, and I think in the planning commission's mind, focused around transportation and access. So you will see certainly in the final decision that was made, the locations where they decided that the most growth should happen is still focused around transportation, either where you're in close proximity to services, like you could walk to, the store or the library or all the other things that you might need, or you might have good access to get on a bus or some other transportation mode to get there. So yeah, transportation is a huge deal. Access to get to services that you need is a significant component and a significant driving factor in certainly the city of Tacoma's land use planning.
Yeah. Alyssa, do you want to talk about that a little bit too?
I mean, I think that Brian hit it on the head. I mean, when we're thinking about expanding housing types and where to do that, it really did start with transit. Like, where is there transit? Where can people get to easily? And that would allow them to access other areas of the city very easily. And that's really important. I have some roommates that live with me in my house through shared housing that for different reasons don't have cars. And living a little bit on the east side, a little bit removed from some things, I really quickly realized how difficult it is for folks to get around because of the lack of access to really close transit stops or transit that runs quickly enough for them to get to another part of town within a reasonable amount of time for doctor's appointments or whatever. So, that really came into play a lot during our conversations around, zoning changes through home in Tacoma. And that really guided our decisions. And, it's not easy because we have this conversation around, does density come first or does transportation come first? And it's this chicken or the egg kind of situation. And, we spent a lot of time on it, but it ended up being something that was really at the core of our decisions. And hopefully it will have some positive impacts and help folks, decide where to live and have more access. So they're really inextricably linked.
Yeah. I think, Rubén, you shared a story with us that really captured that. I don't know if you want to share that story, but just the idea that when those things are not tied, it severely advantages and disadvantages certain people, and it creates, conditions that become untenable. So, I would love to hear, your thoughts on the tie between those two.
Yeah, so one of the things I recognized quickly when I moved to Tacoma, and that I've sort of tried to push the needle on a little bit, is the need to think about development and access to attainable housing always and in relation to how people move in and around and through the city. The story I shared, and I'll give a shorter version, is I grew up, in a place that is effectively a city, but was sort of set up as a suburb, right? It was in Southern California, and my mom did not drive, still doesn't drive. So, going to a doctor's appointment was always a struggle because we often had to take one or two buses. My mom did not speak English, so often at 7 or 8 or 9 years old, I was not only translating at the doctor's appointment, but often also having to figure out where we should go after we got off the bus, right? And popping into this convenience store or that shop to ask, hey, where is this place? Because my mom couldn't ask that question. That's a lot of sort of pressure to put on people who are already probably having struggles accessing good quality services that we all expect from the city, right? Mm-hmm. One version of the city that I think I sort of aspire to and I idealize is a city serves many people many ways. But as a bus rider, as a person that primarily relies on transit, I learn a lot about a city's philosophy by talking to people that ride the bus with me, right? How long they've been waiting. Sometimes they ask me, hey, do you know when the next bus is coming? This happened to me 2 weeks ago. I was walking up to a bus stop. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm so glad you're here. That tells me that the bus hasn't come yet. I talk to people that, work at one fast food restaurant on one side of the city they get off after 6 hours and take a bus to the other side of the city to work at another restaurant. I
Mhm.
think a city tells you what it thinks about its people or who it sees as its people by the people it serves, I would say, through transit and how it
Mhm.
allows people to move or basically immobilizes people. And the ability to move or not move in a city is directly related, I think, to people's social and economic mobility too, right?
Mhm.
I shared a little bit about how we live on the southeast side, and it takes me about an hour to get on the bus from where we live to downtown Tacoma where I work, and it includes a transfer. And so I don't live that far from downtown. We live about 7 miles, and I always wonder, should it take this long to get
Mhm.
to work in a city like Tacoma?
Yeah.
And I guess what I'm being told through the city and its services is that they're making a value judgment about, whose time and whose energy and whose mobility matters the most.
Yeah. I think that's a kind of a profound statement. Just and I know in our conversation, and I'm sorry you guys couldn't all hear that conversation. We were just getting to know each other and kind of deciding what this conversation is about. We had a conversation about how there are people who have resources and there are people that have time. And some of these decisions that we make about where we put things and what transportation we have cost some people resources and so cost some people time. And I know, Brian, I'm going to ask you to jump in on this part of the conversation because we were talking about like, Tacoma 2025 says we want people to have access to not spend more than 45% of their income on housing or transportation combined. And I think when we're talking about the things like home in Tacoma and some of the policies we've tried to push forward, and even policies about whether we have parking spaces or not, are all related to trying to mitigate, the housing costs and affordability with also access to these other services. So I don't know if you want to add something to that.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this is a difficult question. I think, as Alyssa mentioned, about chicken and egg. And I think one of the other things that I recall in our earlier conversation was the word kind of expectation. And I think it's one of the more powerful things. I will say zoning and planning to me is a reflection of the community. And I mentioned it earlier about the community's desires and the community's vision. It's also a reflection of the world around us to some extent and sort of where we are in place and time. Yeah, the transportation's hard, as you say, from a household and an affordability perspective. I think everybody can recognize that transportation is, for most folks, the second largest cost behind the actual housing itself. And the combination of those two takes up, often cases, of the vast majority of income. So there is clearly an equation by where and how housing is located and how much your transportation costs are associated with that. I mean, it's pretty obvious that, for a long time, the development world has been sprawling out and pushing out new housing to find cheap land out on the hinterlands. And yeah, the land is cheaper out there, and in many cases the housing is cheaper out there, but obviously the farther you go out, the farther you got to drive to get to everything, and the less options you have on how to connect to them. So yeah, the chicken and the egg is a really tough one, I think, for the city. Constantly, there is the desire, I think, to say, okay, well, if we're going to do denser housing, then we need the transportation in place first. And at some level, that's hard just from a financial reality perspective. At some level, until you have enough customers or enough riders or whatnot, it's hard to have a lot of empty buses driving around. And like I say, from an expectation perspective, I think we are, as a city, very much in a transition point, where the city has, for the last 100 years at some level, or at least the last 70, probably developed in large part as a somewhat suburban city, where the expectation of most has been to easily drive around, easily park, all those things. And we have to own the understanding, I think, that driving, there's a significant amount of freedom and a significant amount of flexibility that comes with driving. There's a reason why most folks have cars and most folks drive around. Not just because they've been, somehow engineered to do it. I think often people appreciate the positives that come along with that. at the same time, as a continuously growing city, I think we bump into the reality of it's hard to continue that expectation forever.
Mhm.
And that's why I say I think we're at kind of an interesting inflection point here where the city has built out under one version and we're pretty much full. And so now we accommodate more folks. It's really a question of redevelopment and how we're going to modify our existing places. And if the expectation continues that everyone wants to drive around and park easily and all those things, it'd be massive change to the city. Are we really wanting to double the size of all the roads? Do we actually want to live in that place? I'm not so sure
Right.
we do, let alone do we want to pay to create that place and the amount of disruption that actually would take to achieve that. So I think in many ways we are sort of forced to consider alternatives and understand that the chicken and egg problem is real and that expectations, the mass transit is never going to be as flexible and never going to be as simple, but it obviously needs to get better, needs to grow as density occurs as well.
Yeah, I think those are really, really good points. I think, we all think, we've traveled to other cities where we're like, man, this is nice. This is good for a vacation. I don't want to live here. But in some of those places, or DC, or even downtown LA, there's a part of you that's like, oh, I would rather take a Uber or ride the train or ride a bus than try to park in New York. Like I don't even know who chooses to drive in New York. Like that's a non-starter for me, right? But it's a great city, and it's great to navigate. And even Seattle is that way now. It wasn't that way when I was younger, but Seattle now is like I don't want to drive there. I'd rather just get on the train and not have to worry about any of that. And I think it's hard for people to imagine that. And I saw it when we were working on the why did I just lose the name of the plan in South Tacoma? We were working on the Brian, you know what I'm talking about, sub-area plan. People were like, oh, I want this, but it's really hard to imagine when you're living in a place what that place looks like. And so I think for, I want Rubén and Alyssa from the planning commission perspective of trying to create a vision of a thing people can't see yet, and maybe it seems scary to say, well, Tacoma might be different. What is that? What is the conversations you guys have about that? And what do you kind of consider? And then for Rubén, like as a person that's trying to navigate it, working at a college full of commuters that are dealing with all of these issues all the time, how are some of the ways we might, mitigate or try to address those? Alyssa?
That's a hard question, and it wasn't on our list, Tanisha. So
I told y'all that I was going to go off script. Sorry.
That is a great question. Through the Home in Tacoma process, we did a lot of community engagement. We held several, and especially it was hard, especially during COVID, doing stuff virtually. And in a lot of ways, it helped people to participate in this type of civic process that may not have been able to participate otherwise. So on that, in that regard, it's really good. And we did a lot of community engagement. We got a lot of feedback. And I think your point about maybe some folks not being able to envision a change this big or imagine the city that they've lived in for 50 years to be different. That definitely came up a lot. And as far as how to address that, I think we tried really hard to just be really accessible and open to everyone, and to acknowledge some of those uncertainties and some of those feelings, of change. So, change is inevitable. It's going to happen regardless. We understand that this is maybe a bigger change in a smaller time period than maybe people would be used to or would like. But making sure that we're sharing that these types of change are for the benefit of everyone in our community, I think is the biggest message that we're trying to share. Right? It's going to be hard, but at the end of the day, we're hoping it's going to benefit a lot of people, and that's what we have to keep in mind. not wanting to do something for, just a certain group of people, but that's going to help a lot of folks. So that's been a big part of our messaging, and we're going to, continue to do that and continue to talk with and listen to people and try to address their concerns. And hopefully we can get folks on board.
Yeah.
I actually really like the way we're going with this impromptu question, because the word envisioning or vision keeps coming up. One of the original arguments I have been making is that when it comes to getting people out of cars and onto bikes or feet or transit, it needs to be a carrot and a stick approach, right? We can't just take parking away, or we can't reduce, or we can't open up roads for more uses if we're not also offering people viable alternatives to get around, right? You can't do one or the other. But what I do think is possible is taking small steps towards helping people realize what it might be like if they did give up the car, either for a short stay in the city or for a longer stay in the city as a resident. And you bring up, me working at UW, which is a commuter campus, but one of the beautiful things about campus is once you're there, if you happen to be lucky enough to have arrived and found a spot on campus, or what a lot of students do is they'll park for free at the Tacoma Dome and then take the tram in, then the walkability of our campus, despite being on a hill, it's kind of a really nice experience.
Right.
And I read an article this summer where they pulled a lot of people. It was an article about friendships and social relations. And a lot of people kept going back to how nice it was to be in college, right? What one of the people that was doing the research found out is that what a lot of people were describing is the ability to be amongst others, friends and otherwise, because a college experience gives you the opportunity to leave the car at the edge and then spend most of your day amongst others, right? And I think that UW does that really well on a small scale. When I first got to Tacoma, I was really excited because one of our master plan documents showed that as campus grows up the hill, they were going to ensure that there was a pedestrian corridor, I think, up campus, up the spine, that was going to correspond with a pedestrian zone that was was promised by the original developer of what is now the brewery blocks. So that was going to create somewhat of a pedestrian area downtown, which I think, to go back to this idea of helping people envision what might be possible, I don't know if that's still in the original plans for campus. I know we're reworking a master plan. I know that the brewery blocks, that development is up in, it's there might be a new developer there. I'm not sure, but we have to keep inserting the idea that we need walkable spaces that are not impacted by cars. Just to say a couple other things, we had an opportunity to do that during the pandemic by opening up our streets, as other cities did, right, to allow for outdoor eating, etc. A good place for us to have done that is on Pacific, on the end of Pacific. I don't know why the city didn't do that. It did sort of expand these other, the parking space use. And I know that some people say, well, the on-ramp and off-ramp for 705 is right there. But so it's also down the street, right? And that's only like a couple blocks that could have been opened to give people an idea. We do that on New Year's Eve night. Why not do it on weekends, for example? Broadway is another place that we can do that. I've been reading about how other states and cities are doing this. Tempe now has 2 experiments for car-free communities. One of them is called cul-de-sac. The other one, I think, is for 55 and over. Idaho just announced that they're building a new community with state funds that's going to be, it's not going to be car-centric. And I'm really intrigued by what different cities and municipalities are doing to try to get people to envision what is possible when we aren't limited. As much as it does represent freedom for some, Brian, I think that sometimes cars also limit us because we have to find a place to store them. We have to sort of maneuver around other people, and we have to watch out for people. I mean, people are dying in car-related incidents all around the US and in our state also. So I welcome the prospect of having our city start taking small steps and doing small experiments towards getting people to recognize what might be possible in terms of mobility. And we have some good places in our city where we can start doing that.
Yeah, I was going to say, we have some building blocks of spaces where, I mean, you could park on the edge of Proctor and just meander through, and shops, food, bars, bowling. I mean, you can, so we have these spaces. Lincoln District's the same way. Like you can park on the edge and just walk through, see, smell, taste, all different kinds of things, and you don't really need to drive. And I think there's opportunity to expand that. If we think about the places like for people in Washington that we love to go, like, ocean shores and all these, places that we go out onto the coast, those are all places where you go to a main strip, you park your car and you don't drive again. Like you walk and you experience that, being with other people. And I think, that is what downtowns of big cities feel like. You walk around, you go to different store shops, and you get the vibrancy of that. And I think about, that's good for everybody. That's good for little kids. That's good for older people. And I remember the first time I went to New York, and I'm watching this like 4-year-old with a helmet, like riding their bicycle in Manhattan on the sidewalk. And I'm thinking, that's such a different childhood than I had growing up here. Like, my mom was afraid for me to cross Military Road. That was like the big deal, and it's like, no, this kid is riding a bike with a helmet on the main strip in Manhattan. You know what I mean? So I do think, just imagining that difference is a huge thing. Brian, were you trying to jump in there and say something?
I was just going to say, and it's sort of building a little bit on what you said. One of my favorite things to do is always ask people about where their favorite place is or their favorite city they've been to. And I have to say, I've never run into a circumstance, I think, where somebody mentioned a super car friendly place that they were just really in love with. It's usually a city or a downtown or someplace like that that is not so auto friendly at the end of the day, and is much more human friendly. It's about people, it's about interactions and things like that. I joke, even those folks who say something like Disneyland, which isn't really a city obviously, and it's kind of a fake place, but there's not a single car essentially in Disneyland. You park your car out in the garage or whatever, and then you spend all day walking around. So and then the other thing, I think a little bit to Ruben's point, one of the things I often hear the most inside the city that people love is the farmer's market or the street party. It's actually times when we kick the cars off the street and the people take over the street. In fact, is like, it feels like you're sort of bad, almost like, oh yeah, you're taking over this space where you're not normally supposed to be, and yet we're all bumping into each other and interacting and communicating, and you really feel the vibrancy of the city in those places. So I think it is a real challenge to sort of balance in many ways, like I say, people's expectations and the convenience of what they've come to see, as well as sort of creating the kind of vibrant and engaging places that ultimately people want to be in and to live in.
I think that leads us right into our next question. Like, for individuals, transportation and housing decisions are often weighed against each other. Like, do you live in the bustling part of downtown where there's no place for your car, or do you live out farther? And I think you talked about this, Brian, for a bigger house, more land, you move farther and farther and farther out, but then that means you got to spend 45 minutes in your car trying to get in on I-5. And so these decisions are weighed. Is there ways through either zoning, through planning, through policy that we can close those gaps, and maybe also through, just education and some of what you said, Rubén, through actual experience? And whoever wants to jump in here can.
I'll say, I'll just quickly, there are trade-offs. And I think at some level we have to own those trade-offs. I think that, the city is in a shift and the city is changing. Transportation and housing are inextricably linked. We do think about them together all the time. But at the same time, we need to think about the city in a different way. I sort of often internally kind of joke about, and I mentioned earlier, the city has largely developed for many, many decades as a bit of a suburban city with that expectation. And from a zoning, in the zoning world, suburbs are in many ways the ultimate reflection of separating stuff. The commercial stuff goes over there, and the residential stuff goes over there, and the industrial stuff goes over there. And sometimes you've even got a huge buffer between them. So nobody has to practically even look at anybody else or have the impacts of anything that might be slightly different. the city is a different place. I think the city's vision is to be a different place. And at the end of the day, if culturally the city wants to be a suburb, it's probably not going to do a very good job. It's never going to be a better suburb than the real suburbs. Tacoma was developed as a city, and it needs to figure out and make sure it can be the best city that it can be, the best mid-size city that it can be. And that's different. Like I say, it comes along with different expectations.
Yeah, absolutely. Rubén?
Yeah, I actually, since you last mentioned that when we first talked, Brian, I've been thinking about that a lot, right? So one way to think about it is, what do we want as individuals? And I think that often emerges, often the loudest voices emerge about what they want for the city, but cities are not necessarily collections of individuals, right? They're collections of communities. And so I'm really intrigued by the idea of, okay, there's what I want, but then there's what the city wants. And if we think of the city as a collective of communities and individuals, then, we would probably be a really bad suburb, but also I don't think we need to aspire to be a New York City, for example, or a Seattle. We don't need to aspire to be those things. I think Tacoma is a unique place with unique communities, unique needs, and unique strengths. And in some ways, I think we could even become a model city for the 21st century, right? If we continue to have conversations like this. I've always been attracted to cities that give you the idea, the impression, the experience of, regardless of where you live in the city, you are essentially in a community, right? In a village. It provides you with a place to recreate, a park, a plaza. There's a local bar or pub to go to. There are restaurants. There are places to run into your neighbors. There are places to create community. And I think there's very different versions of how to get to that. But I think for me, the most accessible cities, the most fun cities are the ones that someone could grow into and, realize, like, I belong to this place and this place belongs to me. There are places in Tacoma where that's starting to happen, right? Where I could see myself living, walking out my front door and realizing I don't have to get into a car to grab a great cup of coffee and run into the same 3 people that I run into 3 times a week and talk about the weather or sports or politics. I also can walk to a convenience store, and if I need some milk or some vegetables, right, I can get a really great slice of pizza if I go this way. And if I go that way, I'm going to run into, a group of moms, right, that take their kids to the park every day. And the sidewalks, right, are they're well maintained so I could get there. And yeah, there might be cars moving around, but it's not a competition between me and the car, right? We're sharing space. I think Tacoma is already showing promises of becoming that type of city, a collection of communities, a collection of spaces. But you're right, I do think we're at an inflection point. And so what do we need to do to further push us into the type of place where we can all find our place?
Yeah. So Alyssa, you're our person who stepped into the space of volunteer. How do, like, these are conversations are obviously really important. And, you're not a planner, you're not someone who had a background in land use, and you stepped up to be a planning commissioner, and maybe just sharing with people why you made that choice, and then, inviting and maybe explaining some different ways people can bring their voice to the conversation. Maybe they don't have the time to be a planning commissioner, but there's opportunities for them to share their thoughts and feelings about what Tacoma should grow into and what we should do in these points.
Most definitely. Yeah, I am not a planner by trade, and luckily we have lots of code nerds, as they call themselves, on the planning commission, which is great. But yeah, I think we all have a stake in this. Everyone who lives in this city has a stake in this and has an opinion. And obviously one of the ways to share those opinions is to come to things like this or come to information sessions. But also serving on a planning commission. I know that there's, I think it's someone in the Q&A wanted to shout out the Transit Oriented Development Advisory Group has some openings right now, and you don't need to be a planner to be or to be on in these spaces, because your experience living in this city is the expertise that you need to be on these commissions, on these boards, on these committees, anything, you know, that's available. And one of the main reasons I got involved is, you know, I saw things that were happening in the community. I work in the community a lot, so I you know, saw a lot of things and thought about, okay, how can I take my experiences to the next level and impact some policies? And then back to this question of you know, weighting stuff against each other. I know that zoning is a way that we can break down those barriers theoretically and like physically, as Brian and Rubén have said, breaking down these physical barriers that separate people throughout our city. So I thought that was a really important you know, place to be. And it's been a, you know, a wonderful experience. We've been working really hard and you know, hoping that we can enact some real change in the city. So you know, I encourage anyone that, we have a lot of people here today that are really interested in this, and I hope that, you know, this captures folks and they want to, you know, put their curiosity and their passion into play in some of these spaces. So you know, it's for everyone, and you know, we are the decision makers in our city as residents, as community members, and we get to decide what we want.
Yeah, that's really great. Brian, Rubén, you have anything you want to add to that?
I'll wait for the next question. I think it feeds right into that. So
Yeah,
we can move on.
yeah. So I mean, oh, I lost my place. You know, how, you know, who I'm losing my thought. You know, how do we create the spaces, and how do we gather the information in who, you know, who, I think Alyssa just said it really well. It's like, this is all of our city and we all have a different point of view. We have different perspectives, but you know, how do people engage in that, and how do people you know, make those decisions?
Yeah, I was just going to build a little bit on what Alyssa mentioned. I really like the statement about we are the decision makers. I think it can be easy to think that planning is a technical exercise. And I think it's super important for folks to understand that it's not. There are components to that certainly that are technical, but planning is a community exercise. And that's why I said earlier that it's about the community's vision. It's about the community standards, about how it sees itself and how it wants to control and steer development in the future to best meet those goals. You know, it is a political and social and cultural conversation as much as it is a technical one. And I think, you know, a lot of times there is this perception that the government is this like machine over here that's like doing things to us. The decisions on these types of planning and land use things are made by the city council at the end of the day, you know, and that's a group, and those are your neighbors that are there, your representatives. And so it is citizens that are there helping to make these decisions ultimately and decide what is the right vision and what are the right rules that help us move in that direction. So one of the things I really love about Tacoma is it has a lot of the positives of a city, you know, the sort of arts and culture and vibrancy that comes along with being a city. But it's still in so many ways a small city or a small town, in that there is a lot of access. Community members have a lot of influence. They can directly contact their council members. They can come to planning commission meetings, and they can really influence things. I mean, I think there is, you know, we heard through, you know, Home in Tacoma, again, a huge recent project and one that's continuing on as we look forward. We heard a lot of consternation in the community about how that came forward, about the community engagement, about whether people really felt like they had the opportunity to influence what is a really big decision. And I think it's important to recognize that the proposal changed dramatically. And I really mean dramatically, based on the community input. I mean, there's certainly people that still don't like it and some that don't think it went far enough or whatever, which is often the case when we have these sort of community-wide conversations. But there was a lot of impact there. And so I think it's really important for folks to know that they can get involved if they're interested. They can engage and they can really make a difference on how the city is moving forward and how the city, as I say, is sort of going to move through what I think is a really interesting transition point.
I also want to follow up on something Alyssa said, which I think is very important. Your experience of a person who lives in the city is enough. I do think in the handful of places that I've lived, in cities that I've lived, I've never felt that I've been so called in to decision-making processes as I have in Tacoma. What do we do with our budget? How do we do police oversight better? How do we make room for more people in the city? BRT, as a person who lives here, this is probably the first city, and I've mentioned this to friends and family, where I feel like I am directly being called in, not because I have any sort of expertise or training, just because I live here and I have a vested interest in the type of place that we are. And I do think that I do think that the city has done a pretty good job of doing that sort of messaging, right? Come in and join or give your input on these things. Metro Parks does it, the county does it, surveys going around. At the same time, I recognize that I'm a person that has time. We're talking about resources, and time is a resource. I have time, I have connections, I have that sort of access. I even have a platform. But I don't always think about myself, right? Because I could be one of those loud voices, right, that speaks up for a home in Tacoma and kind of like pushes my vision of the type of city should be. I don't always think about myself. I think about that lady who works 2 fast food jobs, and a lot of her time is spent commuting across the city to get to that job. And that person may also have kids or other family and childcare responsibilities. That person has a real vested interest in the type of city that Tacoma becomes. And even though we may be doing the messaging and the inviting, I don't know if we have created access enough for people who actually stand to be materially impacted by short and long-term decisions as much as we have. And I don't have the answers to that. I think our city does a pretty good job of trying to get that input from a wide swath of people, but I'm always thinking of people who maybe have really good ideas, or at least some idea about what would make their life better in Tacoma. But because of things like zoning, planning, and design, we've also created an experience of the city for them that doesn't let them take part in decision making.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I heard Dr. Medeiros talk one time about, we would build the perfect city if we created a city where someone could come at 4 and come at the age of 4 and stay till the age of 84 and be able to move and live in different spots and still have a city that is responsive to their needs. And I think that that's such important. I mean, you go to some places and like this was built with the idea of a 25-year-old, like this city is not for like a family. This city is not for a like person who's aging. This city is for like a young person who wants to hop from club to club and bar to bar. And once you hit a certain age, you're like, I got to get out of here because I want to have like a life and a house and a family. And I feel like Tacoma is such a magical place where you could do all of those things here if we were all willing to give a little and maybe, vote for or support the things that maybe don't serve us, but we can imagine that there'll be a point in our life where maybe we would want that or we would have needed that, and trying to create that space where we can all get what we need from a city like Tacoma. And I think that's, that does require everybody bringing their voice to the table and being okay with the fact that you're probably not going to get 100% of what you want out of the conversation, but maybe she could be happy with like 45%, 50, 30%, you would be good. So before this has been a great conversation. I feel like we could, keep talking about this forever. And before I jump into the audience questions, because there are some good ones for you guys, I wanted to see if you guys had any kind of closing, statement that you wanted to make before we jump into questions about, you know, what's the one thing from this conversation or from conversations like this that you really want people to kind of hold on to and engage with? So whoever wants to go first can go first. Go ahead, Brian.
I will just throw out that these are big decisions. There's a lot of change happening in the community, and it's a great time to get involved. I think to what the other panelists have said as well. If you are interested in planning stuff that's going on, I think one of the easiest ways to try to plug in is to go to cityoftacoma.org/planning. So I'll plug that. And you can sign up on there for our mailing list. That'll get you all of, every time the Planning Commission is having a discussion, you'll get an email telling you what they're working on. They do a work program every year that talks about the big issues that we're dealing with. And so, like I say, I think it's a great and exciting time to get engaged. And I recognize that planning, certainly at a citywide scale, is sometimes a challenging conversation for folks to grapple with. At the same time, it is an important one and the place where often you can have the biggest impact. One of the challenges we often see is people come to the city when the bulldozers show up next door. And the reality is it's too late. I mean, nobody wants to say that, but it is. That decision has often been made years, decades, maybe ago about what kinds of things can go where. So these planning conversations, I do it for a living, so it obviously intrigues me and excites me. I think they're cool. They can be overwhelming sometimes, but like I say, we're excited. It's a community process, and so please feel free to get involved and get on our email list and check out our website.
Yeah, if I could take a liberty, that is absolutely one of the biggest confusions people have, is that they think the decision that's being made tomorrow was made yesterday, and really the decision that's being made tomorrow was made 15 years ago, and it just took that long for it to happen. And so that's really confusing for people. And even when we're asking them to be a part of some of these planning processes, they don't always hear like, oh, we're creating this sub area plan for the development over the next 15, 20 years. And people are like, no, well, I really want that street. The next time you bring the street crew, like, that's the street I want. And it's like, well, no, we just need the plan so that we can get the money, so that we can get it approved, so that when the opportunity comes, we can build the street. And that might happen in 5 years, that might happen in 15 years, just depends on what the situation is. So, Rubén?
Right. I somewhat just have the same insights as Brian just offered. I think I said during our planning conversation that these conversations can be frustrating, but that in and of itself is not a reason to think that they're not working. I mean, actually, for my take, that means they probably are working, because we have many competing interests sort of emerging and showing up to inform what the city will become. The home in Tacoma process to me was very frustrating at times, right? But I don't know, if that in and of itself is a reason to sort of not participate. As a matter of fact, it probably means that we're hearing from a lot of people, and a lot of what I heard does not jive with me, right? And a lot of what I heard did jive with me. But I think as long as we continue to have these conversations, to participate in them, and to sort of be okay with some of that frustration and that uncertainty, we end up becoming a better city, right? I talked about this class I'm developing about reading and writing cities, and the main takeaway I want for students to realize is that cities are always in flux and they're always becoming, right? And so I think Tacoma is kind of demonstrating that currently, and we have a real chance and a real opportunity to sort of inform the next phase of our city.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate, mostly what Brian said about just getting involved. Like, I'd love to see you in any way, shape, or form, just engaging with any of these processes. And anyone who knows me knows that I am sometimes really aggressive with getting people on boards, and I drag people onto things, and really encouraging folks, at any stage in life to just, get involved and to encourage folks to do that. So that's kind of, my big thing. And then the other thing is to, just continue to learn more. I know there was a comment or a question in the chat that was talking about like other books or resources to learn about things. One of the books that was mentioned there is Color of Law. I read that in grad school too. And then The city of Tacoma has this amazing video called How We Got Here on the city of Tacoma's YouTube. It's not a book, but it's like an hour-long video about the things that we've been talking about the redlining and how zoning has affected the city. So that's another resource. It's like, you want to learn more, there's tons of information out there. You can always connect with us too, like, just one-on-one or anything like that. If you're passionate about it, just keep out there. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. I do. We're going to jump into questions, but I think that thing about cities are always becoming, Rubén, is so powerful. And I grew up here, and so this was all I knew. I'd never been off the West Coast till I went to the college in the Midwest. And I went to the college in the Midwest, and in my time there, we went through a pretty bad recession. And I watched cities not want to change. Cleveland, Dayton, Columbus, Cincinnati, not want to change, and literally watch these cities that were like vibrant historical cities kind of crumble. Now they're reinventing themselves or coming back. But if you look, if you were in the Midwest during that point and you watched Detroit go from this like powerhouse city to now buses of people driving through buying houses for, $5,000 because Detroit didn't take the actions they needed to take to grow into a different city. They still wanted to be this like manufacturing, like there's not a need for that anymore. Like automobile industry is automated now and it's different. And I think that's just a good lesson to know, in reading and studying other cities, like we have to keep evolving and growing and changing. We can't be afraid of what we're going to change into, as long as the people in Tacoma, stay the people in Tacoma.
And what I'll add to that briefly is that because cities are always in flux and always becoming, if we're not taking part or starting and evolving these conversations, there's always outside interest that will do it for us. And we have seen so many cities remade by outside interest for outside interest at the expense of the people that are and were in that city.
Amen. All right, we're going to jump into these questions. I don't know if Brian or Rubén, did you have any other books? That was one of the questions. Were there books or things that people could study? Alyssa gave a couple, but do you guys have any other additional books that are maybe specific to the Pacific Northwest and talk about some of the things that happened here?
I don't right off the top of my mind, but I think it would be a great idea to have some sort of follow-up resource, like a bibliography of books, websites, articles, right, that people can refer to. And I could add to that.
Yeah, I'll say I don't know the specific Pacific Northwest planning or zoning history that I've ever seen. It's a great question. I'll throw out this is the one I'm reading right now, Segregation by Design. So a third of the way through it. So kind of in the same vein of color law, which is also a great book.
Yeah, thanks. All right, next question. Awesome panel, I agree. I'm wondering if there are any best practices around ensuring that increased density actually opens up a range of housing options and costs. I know that's been a big topic here about density and affordability and how those relate. The Live in Ballard and heartily supported increasing density, but that the new apartments and multi-units housing are more expensive than the older housing and that they are replacing. It's aggravating. Yeah, I'll leave it there. So any answers to that, best practices to make sure that we are increasing affordability while we're dealing with density?
I will say, this has been a huge part of the Home in Tacoma conversation. And this is a really tough nut to crack, honestly, because new development, new construction inherently is expensive just because of the cost of labor, the cost of materials, and everybody knows those things have even been going up quite a bit recently. So new construction is hard to have to be technically affordable. The other challenge is you're inherently having a conversation about what would have happened had you not done anything. I think at some level people try to weigh the change that they've seen against the way things used to be, when that's not really a fair comparison. There were two options. We could have done nothing and we could have done whatever we did, I guess, or something different. And so the idea of affordability getting worse in places where we see density, I think the question is what would have happened had we not allowed anything. and inherently chances are the existing development would have continued to get more and more expensive. And this is a place where government has limited power at the end of the day. Zoning is a tool, and like most tools, like a hammer can build a house or break a window, right? So things can be used well or can be used wrong. And at the same time, zoning only controls so much. Zoning doesn't force a market to do something. I mean, the vast majority of housing that's built in this country and in Tacoma is done by the private marketplace. So I would say the studies we have done and what we did as part of our home in Tacoma did show that increasing density has a positive effect. But that doesn't mean that it gets to the lowest levels of affordability where there still continues to be need, that there are inherently other tools, and it's really financial tools primarily that are necessary to subsidize housing to get to the lowest levels of affordability. So that's why home in Tacoma is certainly not the silver bullet. It doesn't stand alone. The city has an affordable housing action strategy for which this is really one of many, dozens of initiatives that the city has taken up to try to have an effect on affordability. But affordability is really hard. And I sort of make the statement about the affordability gap is kind of like a train driving away from us. And the affordability station is a couple of steps back, probably. And likely the best we can do with the powers that we have at this point, and certainly from a zoning perspective, is to try to slow it down a little bit. That is ultimately the goal, not necessarily to stop it or try to turn the train around, because
so Rubén, you.
I just wanted to add to part of the Home in Tacoma process includes a joint effort between some members of the Planning Commission as well as the Human Rights Commission to form the Housing Equity Task Force, which is kind of tasked to look at some of these other impacts that housing and zoning has around equity and affordability. So we've been working monthly for probably a year plus now. Time escapes me these days, but it's been something that from the get-go has been really important to the process. And together in this task force, we're looking at what types of either city policies or financial policies can we put in place to assure some sort of affordability, as well as mitigate risks of displacement that we know sometimes happens when more development or more density comes into certain areas. So that's been a great process. Myself and a few of my other planning commissioners sit on that board or that committee, and it has been really, really important to explore some of those things and try to figure out ways we can make this the best outcome, affordability wise, equity wise, for our community. So that's been part of the process as well.
Yeah. Appreciate
the only thing I'll add, it sort of builds on Brian's point that home in Tacoma is not a silver bullet, but I think the fact that it became so high profile and contentious, there are reasons why it became that almost have nothing to do with the actual process of planning and zoning. But I think the reason it sort of rose to that level of contention is because for many of us, there's some real high stakes here, right? But I think as a city, we have a real opportunity to sort of say, hey, this is one in a suite of options that we could explore. And it's going to take care of, this middle housing thing that we want to sort of get a handle on. But it's not going to be the overall solution. And so now perhaps the city, along with community partners, institutional partners, can start thinking about other ways of sort of taking the pressure off one policy to sort of start exploring what other options we have, right? And I think there are some good ones coming online, but the other thing I think is important, and this is my colleague at UW Tacoma deserves credit for this, is I think we also need to start having conversations about the sort of whether or not we could fully achieve something like affordable housing, and what the difference is when we talk about attainable housing, right? Because affordable for who is always the question I ask.
Right.
Who is the benchmark that we're using to sort of establish the metrics that define affordable housing. And I think, you know, depending on who you talk to, affordable is going to be affordable for a small subset of people in the city, but maybe not for most. If we start to also talk about attainable housing, then we might be able to expand the notion of who in the city could actually attain the type of housing that they need. And then there are different ways then that opens up even further territory to start thinking about other possible policy and community solutions towards that. But I think we want to work towards housing that's attainable for most people in the city, not merely affordable according to some sort of, I don't know, market or economic metric that may not make a lot of sense for people that, you know, are not making that much money in our city.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, and you have to have enough housing for the people that are here. You start having conversations about price rate, because as long as there's competition, our society is set up that competition, limited supply and high demand is going to create higher costs. That's just that's the system we live in, right? And so either we have to figure out a way to carve out housing that's not part of the competitive process, or we have to have enough housing that there's some leftover that we can subsidize, whatever. But as long as people are competing for it, the government's never going to have enough money. The housing authority is never going to have enough money to be able to compete against a person who's cashing out in Seattle and coming down with $500,000 in hand. Like, I want to buy that house. I mean, we don't have those type of resources. So we've got to make some value decisions about, should housing even be competitive? That's whole, I won't take us down that rabbit hole, but there are things that we really have to figure out how you would carve out properties that you could have at 30%, or, you know, these numbers that are really low. And for the person who maybe bought that house for purposes of extra income, that doesn't get them there. And so there's lots of parts to the affordability problem that are exacerbated by the fact that we just don't have enough units for the number of people we have, regardless of how much money you have. So our next question is, based on the input of the public regarding zoning, what were the most valuable insights that you see that the majority of Tacoma folks want to see in the zoning process? So were there things that happened or comments in the Tacoma process, or even the conversations that you maybe attended, Rubén, that kind of teased out as the big issues that or maybe even the big points of contention that we need to be thinking about going forward?
Do you want me to go first? Or
Hey, whoever wants to jump into that.
I'll start. Because there's a lot. We got thousands of comments throughout our community engagement process, and so it's hard to pick out, you know, some of those big ones. But I'll say it just from my experience and thinking back on the process and some of the stuff that we heard. There was a big conversation around equity, right? And wanting to see more equitable practices in zoning, and the use of the Tacoma equity map was a big piece of that. Wanting to see people have access to more of those areas of access, and another thing that we heard was just about the process. People wanted to be really informed. They wanted to be really included. They wanted to make sure that we're spending enough time addressing issues and concerns and listening. And that was great, right? Because we wanted people to be involved. We want that input. We want those things. So that was something that we heard a lot of just across the board that for me right now just kind of stick out.
Yeah, I would say, I think, and I mentioned it earlier, Home in Tacoma represents a huge change, and I recall saying something, I think it was to the city council, I don't know, a year ago or 2 years ago or something like that, this is a 70-year deal, that the existing zoning pattern of the city has been in place basically since at least the 1950s. And the idea of changing that is really tough. it's a big shift for folks to understand and grasp and even contemplate how it would affect them on a daily basis or even long term. I think that, the other big piece earlier, I think, that, we have to plan to accommodate a lot more folks, and we don't have a lot of green fields to build stuff in. And, we're not adding land out in the bay or anything like that. So, the only way we grow is at some level by growing up and getting denser. And so I think it forces us all to think in many ways about how we define what a good neighborhood is. I think that's a lot of the core of the discussion is for so long, the definition of a good neighborhood has been couched in this idea of single family housing. And the city council adopted a policy that said, no, that's not going to be our core understanding of how we organize the residential areas of the city. And so that really leaves us with the question of how are we going to ensure that in the process of accommodating new development, infill, bigger stuff, and more people, how do we preserve that which we love about our neighborhoods and ensure that at the end of the day, we still have great neighborhoods, places that people want to live. I mean, we're trying to allow for more development and more infill in neighborhoods so that more folks can enjoy that, but you don't want to mess it up in the process, right?
Yeah.
This gets to a little bit of that, but although some of these concerns, and maybe this is a little bit about what Brian's talking about, but although some of these concerns, I downloaded a number of these public comments because you can't read them all online, but some of these were couched in very racist terms. But the ones that you could that were not sort of couched like, well, we've built this neighborhood over time, we don't want these types of people coming in to change it. There are other versions of those comments that I thought, to Brian's point, were sort of not couched in that type of racist language, but more in terms of, hey, there's a particular look to this neighborhood, there's a feel to this neighborhood. And to Brian's point, we've for a long time have built this notion of what a good neighborhood is. And there's real concern about what Tacoma will look like, right? If not just the neighborhood, then a section of the city. And sometimes as a person that drives around, walks around, visits other cities, I sometimes hear those comments, right? We sometimes get these gray blocks of generic looking buildings that if I had a house or I had a row house next to it would be kind of a point of consternation for me. Now, given so much of what we can build in cities in terms of infill and building up in density is a process of regulation, right? You need to have a certain number of stairs, you need to have a certain number of egresses and ingresses, parking limits, all of that informs the types of buildings that can go up. So I do hear that there's a lot of concern about sort of the uniqueness of the built environment that Tacoma already has and how that might change if we end up building a lot of generic 4-story, 5-story, 6-story buildings that don't add to what we have in the city. They actually detract from it. So I think as a city, we need to have really meaningful conversations about how we preserve a lot of, I think Tacoma's built environment is quite beautiful in most places, right? And for example, the way campus has built out and the museums next to it, they're very respectful of what was there and what could come up. And I think if we, insofar as we continue to work with the community, ensure the community that we will work with developers to have that respect to sort of preserve the beauty and the uniqueness of our built environment, we might see some of that concern assuaged.
Yeah, it's a great point. So how do we go about accommodating over 1 million new people in the coming decades in the most eco-friendly and equitable way? Just one idea from each of you.
So I'll say the million number is not Tacoma's responsibility. So if that scared anybody, don't get too worried. But that doesn't mean our number isn't big. Our number is like 100,000. So, the city's supposed to grow, by 50% over the next 30 years or so. And at some level, that is our role in the region as being the metropolitan city in Pierce County. the state and the citizens in many ways spoke 30 years ago and said that, hey, the right way to protect the environment, preserve what's lovely about the Pacific Northwest is not simply to build houses all the way from downtown to Mount Rainier. And so, yeah, our challenge and our opportunity in a place like the city of Tacoma is to figure out how to accommodate all those people well. It's why I mentioned earlier about the opportunity in front of us, that Tacoma is going through a lot of change and will continue to do that, not simply because we play our role, but there are a lot of folks coming here, and that's one of those outside forces, whether we like it or not. The folks are coming, and if we don't figure out a positive way to try to accommodate them as best fits in with our vision, then they're still coming, and they will undoubtedly change this without as much of our local influence in it.
Yeah, I think that was one of the great points that Rubén made about that. If we don't change and if we don't grow, then someone from outside will change and grow us, and it might not be in the ways we want. And so staying engaged and being a part of those conversations and creating visions of what we want and getting that thing. I mean, I left for 20 years and came back. And while Tacoma was way different, it was still very recognizable. There were certain things that I was like, wait, I don't know where to turn because there's supposed to be a pink elephant on this corner where I turned and it wasn't there anymore. But I still knew, oh, this still feels like the Tacoma I left at 17, coming back at 40. So it's gone a little bit longer than 20 years, but you got the point. I came back and it still felt like Tacoma. And I think that is, if that we can hold on to that, I think a lot of people could be comfortable with the changes as we move forward. But Rubén, your idea?
I wanted to say, so part of the question is, how do we do it in an environmentally sort of just way? To go back to a place where we began, I think a lot of it is going to come down to how we also expand transit and mobility options. Right now, one of our big problems in Pierce County is that people commute to Seattle or other parts of the Sound to work, and those commutes are some of the longest in the country, right? 60 to 90 minutes, depending on where you're coming from. We know that people sitting in cars is one way that our local environment is being impacted in multiple ways. It's not just carbon emissions. We now know that sort of the microplastics coming out of tires is impacting our waters and the fish in them. So if we continue to think about where people live, where people work, and how people get to and from, then we might realize that one of our priorities is to do even better than what ST3 is proposing to do. Because our links to the rest of the region are not going to become less. They're going to become more. Tacoma has historically struggled to keep work centers here. We often lose them to Seattle, and people need to work. So insofar as we aren't sort of building an economy that assures that people could live and work within a certain short distance and get there through transit, then we need to ensure that people have many and more options to get to and from where they are going to work that doesn't require single occupancy vehicle trips. And that, I think, will be a big impact. There's other conversations to have about our policies around the port, et cetera. But I think one thing that we can continue to focus on is how we get people in and out of the city that doesn't require them to get into a car.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And like for me, spending 2 years working at home, I realized how unwalkable. I don't live in the city of Tacoma. I live out in the suburbs, but how I could really not have needed a car for these last 2 years, except for there is nothing that I could get in. I can walk to a 7-Eleven and I can walk to one restaurant that is 2.5 miles downhill, which means I'd have to walk 2.5 miles uphill after eating, which would not work out very well. So, just thinking about the completeness and compactness of neighborhoods when we are going through a major shift in even where and how some people work. It doesn't affect everybody, but there's a lot of people who will never go back into an office environment. And if their neighborhoods were complete, they could that's a whole expense they could get rid of and just walk their neighborhood. And that would do wonders for the environment. It would do wonders for small business. It would do wonders for our health and our wellness. And so, yeah. Alyssa, I think I'm going to give you the last comment, and then I'm going to pass it back to Laura.
I don't know that there's much more I can say. I'm just really grateful for that question, because I think that's maybe one of the things we don't talk about as much, about the environmental impacts of more dense cities. You know, sprawl is bad for the environment for a lot of different reasons. And so, you know, creating density within our cities can mitigate some of those impacts. And so Rubén said all of the things. And so I'm just really grateful for that question. And I'm happy that we're thinking about environmental impacts of housing and along with all of these conversations that we're having. So that's great.
Yeah, I just want to thank all of you so much for having a wonderful conversation. Like I said, sometimes I feel like we made them longer because I thought, oh, well, we'll get, and I still feel like I have like 15 more questions I want to ask you. So thank you so much for being with us today. Thank you to the audience for sticking with us and asking some great questions. And with that, I'm going to pass it back over to Laura.
Thank you so much. I just want to say there were so many awesome questions in the Q&A. Thank you everybody who submitted those. Yeah, really awesome. So much thanks to all of our panelists today for spending time with us, sharing your expertise. Really, really appreciate it. And to Tanisha for moderating this conversation. We hope that you'll join us for the February Friday Forum. It'll be on February 25th. It's called It Takes Two, Housing and Transportation. So if you liked the conversations that we had about those two topics today, we'll dive even more into it next month. So that'll be really great. A recording of this forum is going to be available on our social media. So if you like this conversation, we encourage you to share with your friends and your family. Send it to grandma, tell her about how important zoning is in her life. And I just want to say last off, these events are free to attend, but they're not free for Downtown on the Go to put on. So we ask that if you enjoyed the conversation, you consider supporting our work with a donation. You can find more information at our website or on our social media, Downtown on the Go. Thank you again, everybody. I hope you have a great weekend, and we'll see you in February.